Now, Libya's political crisis deepened on Tuesday as some presidential candidates met in Benghazi to discuss how to tackle a collapsing electoral process. Rival armed groups mobilised in Tripoli early on Tuesday, closing off roads in the south of the capital.
The meeting is the most prominent of several rounds of talks over recent days between candidates, factions and foreign powers about delaying the vote. The presidential election was meant to take place this Friday. There's also concern about whether an interim government can continue in power after the December 24 deadline. The group meeting in Benghazi, including Eastern Commander Khalifa Haftar and the former interior minister, are aligned against the interim prime minister who is a rival candidate. The interim government and the election process were created last year under a UN-backed roadmap to end the turmoil that followed the NATO-backed uprising that ousted Muammar Gaddafi. The United Nations envoy arrived in Libya on Monday to manage the expected postponement of the presidential elections.
Well, for more on this, we're now joined by one of our regular commentators, Editor-in-Chief of the International Interest, and he joins us now from the UK. Sami Hamdi, thanks very much for joining us. When we last had a conversation, the likelihood of this election just was starting to look almost as if it wasn't going to happen. It looks less and less likely today, I guess.
It does. The election committee announced that it's winding down its operations or its preparations to hold the elections. Polling stations have been asked to close. Essentially, it appears that the elections are all but officially delayed now. And what we're seeing now is the political factions are now jostling for a place at the table with regards to the political process. There's talk now potentially changing the interim government, changing the personnel. The Prime Minister might stay as he is, but there will be a reshuffling of the government personnel, and that's what the meeting is about that's taking place in Benghazi that you alluded to earlier, that brings together Haftar, the former Interior Minister, Fathi Bashagha, who comes from Misrata, which is one of the western cities. Maitig is there as well, a former Deputy Prime Minister as well, also from the west. So this idea that now everybody is flexing and preparing themselves, but not just on the political front, also on the military front, with regards to the mobilization of certain militias in Tripoli who remain upset that as part of the political flexing, some of their allies have been removed from power, and now they're trying to threaten the Prime Minister Abdulhamid Dbeiba and say, return our allies to power or we'll go to war. That's why we've seen roads shut off in the south, and we've also seen troops be deployed to encircle Tripoli in order to prevent other militias from arriving in Tripoli and exacerbating that military situation. And I think that essentially what you can understand from what I'm saying is, as a result of the delay in the election, we're now on the verge of heightened tensions and chaos that may actually escalate into conflict and the deterioration, at least in the political dialogue or political process, that's been the dominant theme over the past 7-8 months.
So who's not in Benghazi, and how significant might that absence be?
I think it's important to stress that those who are in Benghazi are those who are deemed or popularly perceived to have lost during the political process. They are those who felt sidelined by the political process that delivered the current interim government and delivered Abdulhamid Dbeiba to the premiership that made him Prime Minister. And for some context, just so the viewers can understand, Bashagha, the former Interior Minister who is in Benghazi, actually ran during the political process on a ticket with Aguila Saleh, the head of the House of Representatives from the East. And what that means is that Bashagha was part of this ticket during the political process that promised to unite the East and West. It was an alliance between East and West, an alliance between a weakened Haftar and a rising West, or a prominent West after Turkey's intervention. And what happened was, when everybody believed that this ticket would win, that Bashagha would become Prime Minister, that it was all sorted and that this was what was going to happen, that Turkey and Russia had agreed, that Egypt had agreed with Turkey, that Haftar was going to be sidelined, that all of suddenly Libya was going to embark on this very tough political process, but stable and predictable one. What happened was in the second round of voting during the political process, the other Libyan faction said, listen, Bashar is going to come out the strongest in this, which means all of us are going to be relegated. Whereas Abdul Hamid Dbeiba is a nobody with no alliance behind him. He's not backed by anyone. He doesn't have a militia. He might be easier to control. So let's vote against Bashar. Let's vote against this alliance between East and West so that at least we can maintain a status quo whereby we still have a share of the cake. And that's what happened. So Bashar in Benghazi is a return for him. It's after being isolated from losing the vote during that political process, Bashar now is in the East to negotiate a new deal with Haftar, a new deal with the Eastern forces to present this sort of ticket by which it suggests that East and West can unite to form a government. It's a challenge to Abdul Hamid Dbeiba in Tripoli, the prime minister, a challenge to his premiership, given that he wants to stay on, he wants to continue to rule Libya. But it remains to be seen whether this meeting will have a significant impact or not, because it's important to stress that while Bashar has sought to embark on this rapprochement with the Eastern forces, Dbeiba has done something similar as well. And it's not far-fetched that Dbeiba himself will try to embark on a similar project, inviting Eastern leaders to sit with him. And now the US ambassador is essentially scrambling to try to find some sort of consensus, at least to form an interim government, while they lick their wounds over their failed experiment to try to force through elections on Libyan factions that never wanted elections in the first place.
So a key figure like Haftar, where does that leave him in this process? If this new interim government is constituted one way or another, where will he be in all of this?
The tragedy of what has unfolded over the past year is not that elections have not taken place, but rather that after the Turkish intervention that stopped the Tripoli offensive, that stopped Haftar's offensive on Tripoli, in which he tried to secure a military victory, in the immediate aftermath of Turkey's intervention, Haftar was suddenly reeling. Haftar's influence was suddenly under threat. Suddenly he was scrambling to try to remain relevant. Egypt was starting to ignore him. Moscow was revising its ties. UAE was desperately trying to convince Cairo that Haftar could still be useful and that they should not abandon Haftar. Egypt was elevating the political side of things over the military. Egypt was elevating Aqil al-Saleh. Egypt was starting to talk with Turkey. Turkey was starting to talk with Egypt. Suddenly Haftar, where he seemed this overwhelming presence and this very powerful force, suddenly he was on the ropes. Suddenly he was on the verge of becoming irrelevant, or at least being sidelined, and other parties start to eclipse him. In other words, that he would no longer be at the forefront. But what happened was that the bickering of the militias in Tripoli, their inability to unite, which has become emblematic of how they've operated since the NATO intervention, their inability to come up with a united political vision or back a united candidate that might actually capitalize on the disgruntlement in the East with Haftar, the disgruntlement in Cairo, the disgruntlement in Moscow. What happened was that they still continued to view Libya through their very narrow interest. And as a result of their divisions, they essentially managed to protect a status quo in which they remained in their individual fiefdoms without actually creating that united bloc. So Haftar came back from the brink. Where Haftar was irrelevant, he suddenly was being courted by those who wanted to settle scores with others. Haftar's relevance became prominent because the others could not capitalize on the opportunity to sideline him. And when Bashar and Aqil al-Saleh, who I referred to earlier, when their bid to unite the East and West factions, albeit for their own interests, when their ticket failed in the political process, that made Haftar suddenly far more relevant than he was since the Turkish intervention. And now what we see today is this: with the failure of elections, with the failure of the political process, with the failure to form a united front, with the failure to find a political consensus, Haftar is now kingmaker again. Haftar is now a potent force. Haftar is the most organized force in Libya today. As a result of the failure of the political track in the East, of those who argued that politics works better than the military front, as a result of their failure to bring about some sort of political consensus, Haftar is now stronger than he's ever been before. And that's why we see that these parties are going to visit Haftar, sitting under his flag, allowing him to sit in the middle of them as if he is their boss, as if he is the chief, as if he is the powerful individual. Haftar has come back from the brink, not because of his shrewd maneuvers, but because the Libyans in their bickering failed to capitalize or failed to appreciate the opportunity to really put the nail in the coffin of the most powerful force that seeks to re-establish that authoritarian autocracy, and that actually managed to create a force to impose himself on Libya. And that's the tragedy, in that in the political process that's now emerging, and answering your question directly, in the political process that's now emerging, it's all about negotiations and what will emerge from those negotiations between Haftar and between Dbeibeh in the West. It's about these two particular individuals, and Dbeibeh himself might not even find enough support to sit at the same table as Haftar. What is clear is Haftar's seat now at the political table is secure. Moscow is now reconvinced that Haftar should be backed. Egypt now believes Haftar should be backed. UAE is backed that Haftar should be backed. France believes Haftar should be backed. And the US is very frustrated with the elections and is now seeking a new political consensus, which makes Haftar relevant again. So Haftar is now back from the brink after he was on the ropes after Turkey's intervention, and it's all the fault of those bickering militias that could not agree on a political consensus and instead focused on their narrow interest that they're trying to assert today through military force.
I mean, it's difficult to predict anything about what might happen in Libya at this stage. Things are moving and changing quite quickly. But the High National Electoral Commission is disbanded, as you said. It's election committees around the country. When do you think elections are likely to happen in Libya, if ever?
I think the focus on elections suggests that if we hold elections in the near future, that somehow that will bring about the reconciliation that Libya needs, or the political consensus that Libya needs. But history tells us that elections, in fact, produce the opposite. In 2014, elections were imposed on the Libyan factions, even though they did not want elections. What ended up happening was armed groups rejected the results, seized the capital, kicked out the newly elected parliament, seized the airport, and the country descended into civil war. In other words, elections opened the door to a conflict that could have been avoided if the focus had been on political consensus first and national reconciliation first, before the insistence on elections in an environment in which there's not even a consensus on the constitutional framework. And while that does sound like jargon, the reason that's important is because the issue is, if the parties are not ready to recognize the results, then it's a pointless exercise. And this is why I think that Libya, far from learning from anything from the US or Europe, has far more to learn from the South African experience than it has to learn from anybody else in this ability, or the ability of South Africa to achieve a national reconciliation that helped put to bed at least the armed tensions or that were there during the apartheid struggle. In other words, the ability of Nelson Mandela to reconcile with elements of those who were in the apartheid regime, at least under the banner of the Rainbow Nation, in which justice to some extent was delivered, but that preserved the nation and allowed that transition of power, that allowed the ANC to stay in power. By that, what I mean is the idea of a national reconciliation, a political consensus, an agreement that now South Africa is a rainbow nation and no longer an apartheid state. In Libya's context, an agreement that Libya is no longer a scene for civil war, that now we should genuinely move into a united Libya and a political consensus on this front, and then elections should take place. But when you have a situation where everybody has a grievance, when people have conflicting narratives over what happened, that whether Gaddafi truly fell to a revolution or whether he fell to a NATO intervention, or the atrocities that were committed afterwards by both sides, including the blockade of Beni Walid by the militias of Tripoli, or the mass graves that Haftar's forces dug up, or that Haftar's forces caused, the bodies that they threw in mass graves in Tarhuna and the like, that are continuing to be discovered in recent times. Without that national reconciliation, without that national dialogue, elections are merely optics for Europe and the US to try to push back against Russia or push back against Turkey. Libya needs a human approach. Libya needs somebody to appreciate that these are actually people. These are people who are suffering, who are dying as a result of a conflict caused by the absence of a political consensus. And there needs to be a serious effort at national reconciliation, focused on the Libyans, not focused on great power politics between Russia and the US. And that's the tragedy of Libya, in that that is not on the horizon. That is not a priority, neither for Europe nor for the US. And while the African Union has at times asserted this, that there should be national dialogue, the African Union has been ignored, primarily because if you allow the African Union in, then it naturally diminishes the power of Russia, Turkey, and the United States and France. And I think this is the tragedy of what's unfolding in Libya. And this is why I always argue that countries in Africa, particularly such as Libya and the like, require an African solution, or in Libya's case, it can't have an Arab solution because the Arabs are parties to it, but it needs an African solution. And I do think that South Africa and other countries can share their experiences in Libya and should play a more proactive role in trying to bring these parties together, trying to settle some of those grievances, and actually acknowledge some of those grievances that to this day are not acknowledged between the different parties.
Sami, your insights always greatly appreciated. Thank you so much indeed for trying to unpack a very complex and fast-moving story. But I'm sure we'll have another conversation soon, and so much will have happened in between. Thanks for your time, my brother.
Thank you. Thank you.